My friends, what we're about to see now is not a news summary, it's an X-ray of the collapse. We're going to open the black box of geopolitics and show why the man who leads our country has become a reason for international mockery and disdain. What the system tries to hide at all costs, with the blatant help of the mainstream media, is that Brazil was humiliated at the G7, and that the elections and our electoral system have come devastatingly into the crosshairs of Donald Trump. The American leader sent a direct message without mincing words to the Supreme Court and to Brasilia. While the old media covers things up, we are going to expose the reality. The São Paulo Forum network is being hunted on American soil. The Washington crackdown tightened against the Comando Vermelho, against the PCC, and against the bloodthirsty Tren de Aragua. International intelligence is already arresting financial operators from these factions, both here and in the United States. This is serious. The board is set. And the leader of Brazil, desperate and isolated even by former global allies, is making historic blunders. Going so far as to beg Macron and deny his own leftist identity, trying to please the world, which now undeniably is moving to the right, and to tear away the veil of theater and dryness, as Trump's United States plans to cleanse Latin America of narco-terrorism. I set the cameras rolling and brought directly from the halls of the White House in Washington, the giant Paulo Henrique Araújo. Get ready for a raw, technical clash without the restraints of political correctness. Look at the level of what we're going to reveal here in the next few minutes.
Hello, Shimon Oliveira. It's always a pleasure to be with you and your audience. My friend, look, Lula, really, he started with a speech as if he was going to the G7 to put order in the mess. But I think he forgot that he's a sidekick. He's just someone who's invited to the G7. When he got there, he had to wait his turn to speak, and look, he made several blunders, some that haven't even become public yet. There aren't any recordings, but the main point was really the open exchange of barbs we now have between Donald Trump and the Brazilian president. And what's really important in the middle of all this is that the chemistry is over. The chemistry went up in smoke and practically turned into accusations from one side and threats from the other. Donald Trump not only said that Brazil is getting into a very complicated political situation, but more than that, he gave direct indications that the 2022 elections in Brazil were not fair, were not correct. To use possible terms.
Here in front of everyone, huh? In front of everyone.
In the whole world. That's right, Shimon Oliveira. And that made Lula, even say some things that would be considered crimes, like, for example, taking an electronic voting machine, taking it out of the country, and showing Trump how an electronic voting machine works. Wow, as if that were the problem in the United States, right? Not understanding what an electronic voting machine is. But Lula also said, and I think we can start discussing this here, facts, an important point to look at, that, look, we don't want interference from the United States here, and I hope they don't interfere in the Brazilian elections. So Lula, who has the distinction of interfering in elections throughout Latin America through the São Paulo Forum. Shimon?
A little scared, right, Paulo Henrique Araújo? It's a pleasure to have you here again with our audience. You enrich our channel here. You enrich Brazilians with your information. Guys, it's hard work to do, huh? Straight from the halls of the White House in Washington with the inside story on geopolitics. Paulo Henrique Araújo, once again. Paulo, look, Lula, he really showed the lowest level there. The kind of diplomacy someone can practice, but it's a sign of desperation, right? Notice that he just keeps repeating, Trump can't interfere in the election. Trump can't interfere in the election. He's scared, Paulo. He's afraid that something might happen because there's not much more that needs to be done, right? He's already doing pretty badly here in the eyes of Brazilians themselves. So it doesn't take much to sink his election. All it takes is for Trump to make a few gestures, some kind of statement, and that's exactly what happened. What did Trump do, right? Sending a direct message to the Supreme Court, sending a message about the Brazilian elections, right? Ignoring Lula like that, Lula getting desperate, Lula even went so far as to deny it. Look, that denial from Lula that he was never left-wing, that's also a result of a certain desperation because he's not fitting into this world anymore. He's not finding his place anymore. To the point where he says, no, I'm going to present myself here as a moderate, as a centrist, to see if I fit in with these people. Because that's the trend now. And from what we saw at the G7, Paulo, are you also going to comment on the impact of Trump's role in this event? The trend is to be conservative. The trend is to be on Trump's side, isn't it?
Look, Shimon, and I'll tell you something. This point really shows a situation that Lula started to face in the European media itself. Because back then, around 2024, early 2025 Lula, he made several extremely problematic statements regarding the defense of Ukraine, actually attacking Ukraine in defense of Russia. He gave too many favorable signs and gestures to Xi Jinping's China, something that we Brazilians who follow politics know how this works at its source. Funciona isso em profundidade. However, within Europe, when Lula was elected and received support from several important European political figures, the narrative was that, look, guys, for example, foreign affairs, this one, and that seat of democratic left of a popular man in the arms of the Brazilian people will return here. But Lula warned he would come back in the arms of the Brazilian people. But Lula warned he would come back out for blood. Lula, what he wanted was revenge. And then Lula's peace and love image fell away, and it became clear that everyone knows who Lula really is. And then the Europeans started saying, look, we're starting to see here that Lula is very different from what we thought. We even had articles about this in the French media. So this gesture from Lula of saying, look, I'm not left-wing, I've never been left-wing, I was considered anti-communist. It's Lula at the height of his megalomania, right, of his mythomania, his compulsive habit of lying coming to the surface. But the president himself has already said here that he has been more left-wing than ever, that he was proud to appoint a communist to the Brazilian Supreme Court, but outside the country, he changes his speech. And this point you brought up, Shimon Oliveira, I think it's a key factor in Lula suddenly not realizing where he is at this moment. Lula speaks. He gives his speeches inside Brazil, his statements, as if he were in 2002 when you needed a huge apparatus to get your statements out to the world. Today, with social media in less than 3 minutes, this is in the hands of any president, any foreign minister, any international analyst. So he can't separate his domestic rhetoric from his foreign rhetoric anymore, but he acts as if it were still possible. And then Lula is contradicting himself all the time. And Shimon, one thing that catches my attention, and I've been talking a lot about this, is doing the work of a correspondent here in the United States. We first have direct experience practically 24 hours a day with the American media, and at the same time, we see how the Brazilian media is covering these topics. And I don't think the media should, in a way, campaign for one side or the other. It's not about that, but it scares me how everything lacks context, how the Brazilian media doesn't provide context for things. Lula, he says whatever he wants, and the media simply republishes it. Lula, the media, the Brazilian media, they simply just repeat what Lula is saying, and they don't provide the necessary counterpoints. They don't give the proper context. That's something that's natural in the media here in the United States, for example. No matter who the politician in power is, my friend, and that's scary.
True, they just broadcast it. It's always been like that, right? They didn't accept it. Yesterday, in fact, a report came out saying that the internet, YouTube, has already surpassed television when it comes to news, right? People look more for independent channels like mine, like Paulo Henrique Araujo's, who's here with us, and they trust them more. Because look, how can you trust a network like Rede Globo or Paulo, just as an example, that receives billions, that receives millions? It alone received more than 50% of the government's advertising budget. So you know who's really in charge there. People know it's a rigged game, and people prefer it that way. because the media, after all, needs to save Lula. It seemed like they had abandoned Lula at some point, making harsh criticisms of him. But after a certain point in this process with the master bank today, in fact, another bombshell just dropped. Directly connected to the top leadership of the PT government regarding corruption scandals, about Jacques Wagner, a search and seizure by the federal police at Jacques Wagner's house, the leader of Lula's government, right? The press suddenly goes back to barely criticizing, but really, you made that perfect observation, right? They don't provide context, they don't explain. And really, they rush to try to save Lula from this mess, because we are reporting and telling those who follow us about the fiasco that Lula is causing in Europe. To the point where Macron told him to be quiet in one of the meetings between the leaders because he was completely disagreeing. Taking things out of context, struggling to add context, and showing no grasp of what they discussed. Regarding the use of artificial intelligence and economic issues. And then he stands up, starts a speech that has nothing to do with anything. Everyone stops to look at that strange figure in the middle, and Macron tells him to be quiet. So really, Paulo, Brazil is terribly represented at such an important event, which is the G7, where Brazil could at least bring some business for us. Money, money, money. Who was there along with Brazil? India. But India closed contracts worth billions. Did Lula manage to bring Brazilian beef back to the European market? Paulo, that's the question, right?
That's right. And Shimon, this point you're bringing up is important in two ways, and I want to separate them here so we can understand it well in depth. Because when Macron interrupts Lula, Lula was doing exactly what he said he wasn't, being a communist. His speech was totally following the line of Leninist labor politics, Leninist trade unionism that we had in the European Union. And he was arguing that, for example, artificial intelligence will wipe out jobs around the world, and that it is the state's duty to stop it. Because the state has the obligation to create jobs, because the private sector does not create jobs. The private sector only wants profit, and the one who takes care of people is the state. Well, this is about as communist a speech as you can get. For the man who had just told other leaders in Europe that he wasn't a communist and that he wasn't left-wing, this is a total contradiction. It's hilarious, really. And Macron had to cut him off because he had gone over time. He ran out of time and he got upset with Macron. And here, Shimon, there's a point that I've been making in my speeches for about 2 years. And when I said that, a lot of people doubted that soon people wouldn't care much about Lula, including Macron. And there was an official photo where Macron was, on Macron's left side was Trump, right? And on the right side was Lula. And Lula made a point of holding Macron's hand. And it was like this, Macron holds, watch the video of this. He holds it there and takes some photos with Lula holding his hand. Then he lets go of Lula's hand and stays like this, holding his wife's hand. So what happens? Lula is no longer that figure who, is that moderate, everybody's buddy, the one Obama said was the guy and all that. That image is gone. And this, my friends, is not just talk. You're saying this because you're against Lula. No, that's not it. It's simply an acknowledgement of reality. These are the signals world leaders are sending. And taking this issue of artificial intelligence, we are going through a new industrial revolution. It's a singularity in human history. Just like the invention of the wheel, when man controlled fire, when we mastered aviation, and when the Industrial Revolution happened. And we are living through a new singularity in human history. Human history is going to be profoundly changed from now on by this revolution, even though it's still in its early stages, the revolution of artificial intelligence. And we can see how Brazil is falling behind in all of this, in every aspect. Shimon Oliveira. I did an important show about this week because there are two ways for you to grow in this market. The first is to have productive strength in the sense of creating the technology, contributing. Brazil can't do that. Our best minds are all working outside of Brazil. All our human capital leaves Brazil because there's no investment in science or technology, okay? Brazil is a harmful environment for entrepreneurship, for anyone who wants to start something in that sense. For example, we had the Carioca AI, which was nothing more than a Chinese AI with a new outfit. So Brazil doesn't invest in anything, and even by Lula's own speech, this gets destroyed. On the other hand, there's another path where you could actually have an important advantage, which is with commodities on top of that. Rare earths, important agreements that can be signed. Brazil has gigantic potential for generating electricity.
The data centers, right, Paulo? Brazil could be a paradise. Sorry to interrupt you, it was stronger than me here. Brazil could be a paradise for data centers because the United States and Europe are having a crisis there with green policies and they don't want to allow data centers. But whoever has the data centers will control everything in the world. And Brazil is perfectly capable of having this infrastructure here because we have plenty of water. We have many places where these data centers could be installed. One other observation, Paulo, just to let you know, China is playing the role that Brazil should be playing. And India is starting to play that role. Look, rare earths, you mentioned that very well. See? Trump just closed the $30 billion deal with India 2 weeks ago. $30 billion with India, and guess what this deal is about? Rare earths. And not just the rare earth commodity, but the technology, the ability to do the selection and separation there, which today only China can do in the world. The Americans are going to invest $30 billion in technology in this area, which is the most important area in the world. There are no computer chips. There won't be any processing for the data centers that will run the AIs without rare earths. And Brazil missed out on this 30 billion opportunity because Lula, the fool, keeps insulting Trump, keeps threatening Trump, keeps provoking Trump, keeps making indecent proposals to replace the dollar with the yuan. And he protects cartels, Comando Vermelho, and PCC. And in a moment, folks, don't go anywhere. Paulo Araujo will bring us a summary of what's happening in Latin America because things are heating up here too. Paulo Henrique.
Look, that's perfect, my friend. And to wrap up this point, which you mentioned about Brazil missing opportunities and already tying it to Latin America, there's a new geopolitical organization. And here we're talking about geopolitics. In practice, when politics starts to be defined by geography, yes, with the shield of the Americas, which in Brazil, according to the media, is treated as, no, it's an alliance of right-wing parties. And that's not it. It's about a new geopolitical organization of international relations, and Brazil is outside the shield of the Americas, which is led by the United States of America. Just to touch on this AI issue, what are we seeing? Brazil lost its surplus energy that it used to buy from Itaipu in Paraguay. The United States quickly went there, acquired this surplus, paid Paraguay well for it, and more than that, they set up a plan there. Look, so for us to be able to trust you, we need to clear the area. So for that, we're going to help you fight organized crime. They placed American troops inside Paraguay to help with this, and they are investing heavily in developing urban capabilities. In other words, the United States and American companies are going to invest money in training new scientists and developing technology within Paraguay so they can run the businesses, so that they drive the economy, and in 20 years, Shimon, Paraguay will be a technological powerhouse in South America. And Brazil, what is it doing? Just so we can make a comparison. It opens up to China, like in the case of Camaçari in Bahia. Like there, they bought the Ford factory and turned it into a BYD factory. And they're not developing Brazilian human capital, they're bringing in Chinese workers. That's true. So here we see the difference in how both countries operate in this Cold War.
Paulo, the United States
and China.
Oh, what you just said is brilliant, guys. Pay attention to the difference because both are imperialists. The United States and China, right? There are those who only call the United States imperialists, but they never remember that China is also imperialist and expansionist. But there is a basic difference. The United States invests in people and generates wealth there for the community that in some way ends up submitting to the interests of the United States. And that's the game of geopolitics, right? There is no such thing. There is no fairy tale, folks. Those who have power give the orders, and those who are wise obey. Those who have nuclear bombs and aircraft carriers give the orders, and those who have absolutely nothing obey. What did Paraguay have? They had nothing. They were only smart enough to make a deal with the guy with more power. The guy who's just a little less bad, right, in terms of exploitation. China is exactly like that. This BYD factory wasn't even good enough to give jobs to the people of Bahia. They're bringing in the Chinese to work there, even in construction. There's a video going around of a Chinese guy getting into a fight with a guy from Bahia, and they end up brawling. So why don't they train, right, the Brazilian people? Why don't they teach the Brazilian people? And there's more, right? And there's more, and there's more. There's the whole military issue behind it, right? Because all these facilities are dual use. Everything has dual uses. It's not only civilian. Everything there serves as a weapon for espionage, a weapon for attack, a weapon for monitoring, everything. Even the cars themselves, folks, have sensors capable of fully mapping territory, military bases, government facilities. Everything is dual use when it comes to the Chinese installation. So there's a difference. And the money keeps circulating here. Do the Americans make money? They make a lot of money. But the Paraguayans also make a lot of money. Because there isn't a place, Paulo, I can't name any place, that made broad agreements with the United States to plant the American flag and even have an American military base there. That's poor and miserable, right? Most countries that open trade to the United States prospered a lot. Look at Costa Rica, right? Now look at Paraguay. Look at the changes happening in Argentina with Milei, who also opened the doors for the American military to settle there. Brazil is getting surrounded, huh? The São Paulo Forum is losing its strongholds, Paulo. Losing.
That's right, Shimon. I'm going to pick up exactly on this point you brought up and bring it to the issue of what's happening in Latin America. Because the Shield of the Americas will also deal with the national security of the United States. And they understand very clearly that besides the issue of fighting drug trafficking, you need to invest in the countries, which is the point we were discussing here, but you also need to clear the area. So we have several drug cartels that are in the sights of the United States and have already been designated as international terrorist organizations. Comando Vermelho, PCC, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. We have the Sinaloa Cartel, the Los Soles Cartel, which is Maduro's in Venezuela, and the auxiliary branch, which is the Tren de Aragua. And Trump, he had his eye on the Tren de Aragua since his candidacy. Even in 2024, he was already talking a lot about this. And now the Tren de Aragua, they suffered a very strong blow because the American army operated inside Venezuela to eliminate one of their leaders, who was Niño Guerrero. And look, we already have clear information, and this isn't new. This was already in my book, The São Paulo Forum and the Great Homeland, that the Tren de Aragua operated as an arm. We talk a lot about hitmen in Brazil. They were Maduro's hitmen, okay? And they often operated in coordination with the corrupt wing of the Venezuelan army. Last week, the Pentagon's top commander, Dan Caney, went to Venezuela. And right after his visit to Venezuela, the Venezuelan army was, let's put it in quotes here, but it's the reality, forced to participate in this operation to hunt down Niño Guerrero. And the American army operated inside Venezuela, okay? And it was exactly an American drone that eliminated Niño Guerrero. Now, here's the point that draws attention, okay, my dear Shimon? Tren de Aragua had already been used in various branches throughout Latin America. For example, a deserter soldier from Maduro's Los Soles cartel went to Chile, and he was killed inside Chile. Maduro sent hitmen into another country to kill another soldier, okay? This is documented, and there is a criminal investigation against Maduro and Josue Osdado Cabejo inside Chile. But it didn't stop there, because we had an operation that here we don't have confirmation of. But all the evidence points to the civil police of some Brazilian states, 6 states to be exact, among them Roraima, Amazonas, Paraná, São Paulo, and Rio de Janeiro. They worked there together with American intelligence to launch an operation against the Tren de Aragua inside Brazil. And among other things, Shimon, look at what happened. They were exchanging not necessarily money with the criminal factions inside Brazil, especially Comando Vermelho and PCC, but weapons. They were paying these terrorist factions inside Brazil with weapons. And more than that, who was arrested here inside Brazil? The financial operator, the accountant, the man who took care of the finances, the money of the gigantic narco-terrorist cartel, the one from Aragua. The guy was taking refuge and operating inside Brazil. And he was arrested, Shimon. So we realized that the entire American operation is already expanding into Brazil, which was Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva's greatest fear.
So it's not a matter of if it will happen. It's already happening. And Lula is being eaten alive, right? We also had the arrest of someone involved with the PCC or Comando Vermelho there in the United States. Paulo, can you confirm this information? It seems it was in Miami. Where exactly was that?
Yeah, that's right. It was in the state of Florida, in the Miami area. Look at that, this arrest. And it seems that the person who was arrested now, forgive me, Shimon, his name slipped my mind here.
I don't remember either.
But he worked for both factions. Wow. He worked for both the PCC and the Red Command, according to the Homeland Security Department itself, right? The DHS here in the United States. Yeah, they stated that he was the operator for both factions, probably acting as a go-between. And we know that there are several areas where the Red Command and the PCC have been operating together abroad, so it's not surprising.
So Lula has plenty of reasons to be desperate. He went to the G7, did his thing there, but actually he didn't do anything, right? He did absolutely nothing except embarrass himself and show that he's completely unprepared to lead Brazil outside our country. If here inside, folks, we're already living in economic chaos with major problems like people getting into debt and public safety issues, right? Do you feel safe? I mean, just this week, one of our partners had his car stolen right here at the corner of our studio. So, folks, if things are already bad here, if he can't solve our internal problems, just imagine Brazil's external issues, right? He hates the most powerful man in the world. He's hostile to the most powerful man in the world right now. What are we supposed to expect? Everyone was sucking up to Trump at the G7, Paulo Araujo. The European socialists, pay attention, folks. The European socialists, the European globalists were there sucking up to Trump. All of them, right? India too. Xi Jinping received Trump with pomp and circumstance over there in China, right? Putin always has a good relationship with Trump. Only Lula, guys. Do you realize how isolated Lula is? Even on the side of the axis of evil, Lula was isolated, even Iran. Paulo. Even Iran is making deals with Trump. And Lula can't do anything. But is it that he can't? Or does he not want to? Because here's the thing, it's necessary to completely detach Brazil from the United States in order to take control of the country. It's necessary, right? It's impossible for you to stage a coup, for you to take power, whatever it is. For you to declare yourself king of Brazil without completely detaching, without completely destroying Brazil's relations with the United States. Because the Americans have been present here for 200 years already, right? We've had agreements with the Americans for a long time, since the days of the empire. And it has always been a good relationship. It has always been a relationship of great respect, right? We had some back and forth during World War II, where Getulio Vargas was flirting with Germany. Yes. For a moment, folks, Brazil almost sided with the Axis, Japan, and Germany. But then that changed due to pressure from the United States. And after that, we've always had good relations. Even during the military period, the Americans were involved, and they still are. Don't be naive to think that they won't act in their own interests. And now we have this terrible relationship. But it's bad for us, Paulo. Look, Lula and Moraes are going after the big tech companies. In other words, people's right to speak. And that involves a lot of money, right? Yeah, trade. Lula also puts Brazil in a terrible position. You have reports of slave-like labor in Brazilian companies and companies operating within Brazil. So we are completely surrounded when it comes to this. Now let's wait for the final stretch before the election, Paulo. Because Lula's last attempt, and they went there, they're going to deny this. But they went to the G7. They even moved up the trip to the G7 to try for one last conversation, one last deal, one last handshake with Trump. And they didn't succeed, Paulo. Look,
Hey, Shimon, you touched on a point, right? The electoral one. And that's exactly the point that Lula is directly aiming at in this matter. Because he's trying to frame things in a way that he wins. In other words, if I manage to sit down with Lula first, I'll show weakness by forgiving. With Trump, I'll expose my opponent's weakness, in this case, the Bolsonaro family. And more than that, I'll be the guy who negotiated. I put an end to, in Lula's words, the traitors of the nation, and I'll also put an end to the tariff hike. If I can't do it, I'll talk about sovereignty. I'll make it about us versus them, about the external enemy. And then we saw that he's going for option B, and he's going to try to work with that at all costs. Now, there's a point here that we need to draw attention to. This has worked to a certain extent, yes, in Brazil's electoral landscape. There is a strong anti-American sentiment in a large part of the left-wing Brazilian society. That society ends up deciding the election. It is influenced by the activism that we have in part of the media, by this anti-American sentiment that was instilled back in school. We all went through this. History and geography teachers passed this sentiment on to us. And within the right as well, there are people, there are groups that have this anti-American sentiment. And they end up serving as a kind of echo chamber for this. So Lula will try to work on this issue, you know, the US versus them thing. That's something he's always done. And he'll also try to work on this point, you know, that he's fighting for the country's sovereignty. But actually, we know that he's going to blame everyone except his own administration, his own government, because since July 2025, he knew about the investigations tied to the ordinance or to Section 301 in the United States. More than that, everyone here in the United States and in Brazil was already saying that the end of these investigations would be in June, so he had enough time, a year, to work on this. But no, he prefers to create the narrative that Trump wants to end PICs. Trump wants to end the elections because he doesn't know the electronic voting machine. So that's what we're talking about here. And that's what I even mentioned, that the media doesn't put things into context. And this is very serious even for the Brazilian press, right? The survival of the Brazilian press. We're talking about the country that has the most advanced technologies in the world, that has the most creative minds in the world, which is a leading country or one of the leaders in artificial intelligence, in innovation, in science, in technology. Don't they have the capability to have a system like PICs? Don't they have the capability to have electronic voting machines? Or maybe they don't want systems like that. That's the point. Because here in the United States, for example, you have Zello. But Zello isn't exactly like PICs. Because Americans don't want it. Because to have a system like PICs, they would have to have central government control of Americans' bank accounts. And guess what? Americans don't want the government having access to their bank accounts. Interfering. In Brazil, there is no more bank secrecy. Bank secrecy in Brazil is just a farce. Today, you are completely exposed to the government. Americans don't want that. Another thing, Zello is managed by a company. a consortium of private companies, because Americans don't want the government managing a system that will handle your money, because they don't want something like the collar plan, for example, like what already happened in Brazil. Another thing, Americans don't want an electronic voting system. Why? Because they want to have paper ballots. It's not about having the technology or not. It's about whether you want this technology or not. And Lula's speech is, we are wonderful, the advanced ones, and they can't compete with us. But actually, that's not the case. First of all, a conservative view of American society, which is, look, technology is good, but there are limits to it. And our freedom is above technological conveniences. That's it. The Brazilian media, many times I even have doubts. Timon, if the commentators in the Brazilian media, who are our colleagues, but that scares me, if they have the ability to understand this and convey it to the public, sometimes I have that doubt.
Look, they know what they're talking about and how they're saying it, right? They know they're truly the country's real fourth estate. They know they have the power to persuade, even so. Because you don't need to convince a lot of people, Paulo. What was the vote difference? Let's say the 2022 elections happened in the smoothest way possible. What was the vote difference between Lula and Bolsonaro, right? It was a little over 1 million. It was very little. It wasn't much. In other words, the global network can influence those votes. They really can. You're absolutely right. So they know the weapon they have in their hands. It's just that people are starting to understand the game. Because before, Paulo, conversations like the one we're having here, freely, they didn't happen. Do you think Global would give you the opportunity to share your critical point of view about the government? That didn't exist in 2002 when Lula was elected. That exists now, right? 30 years later. So guys, the world has changed. Globo doesn't want to accept it. Lula doesn't want to accept it. And they joined forces to destroy or to try to pretend that this world doesn't exist. So for Global Network, for Bandeirantes, for SBT, whatever the traditional channel that exists in Brazil, it's very good for them if social networks are censored. It's very good if YouTube is blocked. It's very good if they get rid of Instagram and TikTok from your lives. Why? Because then you'll have to get your information from Global's screen, from SBT's screen, from what the journalists decide or not to tell you. Paulo, look, it's impressive, the information you brought us today about Brazil, Lula. Your final assessment then. How did Lula come out of this G7? Was it positive or negative for him? In your view, from Washington, from the halls of the White House?
Look, to be very clear, it was exactly the same script as the tour he did in Europe in April. The Brazilian media, the press itself in Brazil, and the entire communication apparatus of the government, they presented as a great success. Lula who opens doors, who speaks to the world. But in the corridors, everyone is looking at Lula in that way. Damn, this guy is stuck in the past. It was a parade of gaffes. He made a lot of conflicting speeches, like when he denies, for example, that he is left-wing. And then he defends the entire Communist Manifesto when it comes to AI issues. So Lula accumulated blunders. He accumulated embarrassing situations, like when he was being recorded without knowing it, talking to his foreign minister, his Minister of Foreign Affairs, as if he were just any ordinary assistant. The impact of all this in the world was terrible, but inside Brazil, they'll paint it as if Lula was a great superhero of national sovereignty. That's not how it happened.
Guys, follow Paulo Henrique Araújo on Instagram, on YouTube, and on other social networks as well. We have several out there. Paulo, it's Paulo Henrique Araújo, right? Paulo, there's the big channel PH Vox. There's also the channel with the name Paulo Henrique Araújo. And there's Paulo Henrique Araújo's Instagram, live from Washington, folks, behind the scenes at the White House. You can trust that Paulo brings pure information, so you can then form your own critical thinking.
That's right, Shimon. Just stopping by here. There's PH Vox on YouTube and PH Araujo in the United States. On Instagram, it's PH Araujo Real, and on Twitter or X, APH Araujo.
All right, everyone, we need to get 10,000 more subscribers now on Paulo's channel. He's here in collab with me. Go there and say, I came because of Shimon Oliver. Let's boost it. Let's support Paulo. He's our representative, our source of information there, directly at the White House. So go there and strengthen that community of analysts, the biggest in Brazil. And there's Paulo's book, 2 books that we'll leave for you on the card. Paulo is there in the big bookstores on the internet. Nas grandes livrarias do Brasil?
Exactly. Shimon, I have 5 books that I've published, but these 2 out of the 5 are very important, right? The first is The Fall of Democracy in Brazil. You can find it on Amazon, Mercado Livre, and in physical bookstores. And my main work is Foro de São Paulo and the Great Homeland. It's for understanding the depth of Latin America and how the Workers' Party was shaped by the Cuban dictatorship, Nicaraguan, and how today they coordinate and command many of the actions that are taking place across our entire continent, right? You'll also understand why Lula is so concerned with issues involving, for example, the Red Command and the PCC. It will make much more sense to you, and you'll understand the São Paulo Forum far beyond what is usually talked about on the surface. No, it's not just a group that gets together. You'll see, you'll understand this. It's not just about existing. No, it's the ideology that comes even before that. It's not just that. It's what directs this whole structure. It's about replicating.
Guys, the books are here in the cards that appear on the screen and also in the description. That's it. Yeah, my friends, the official narrative and the media consortiums try to bury us with half-truths every day. But what Paulo Henrique Araujo just laid out here on our table is the undeniable proof that the American siege is closing in. The failed model of the continental left is collapsing under the weight of its own failure and the heavy fight against narco-terrorism. The system trembles when the backstage truth is clearly exposed, and that's exactly why we can't back down even an inch. The war for your freedom requires tools, requires protection, and requires knowledge that television wants you to ignore. So, do you think Brazil's aged relic Lula has his days numbered? Comment right now in the comments. They call us the aged relic if you think we're quiet. We're moving toward this moment. The system uses heavy censorship and persecution to silence analyses like these on open networks. Don't be a hostage to this invisible dictatorship of narratives. Access my exclusive platform now completely free from censorship, our intelligence bunker. We are already more than 3,000 elite analysts who fund the truth inside and who study daily the map of what is really happening. Point your phone now at the QR code that's appearing on your screen and click the pinned link in the description and in the first pinned comment. And now, pay close attention. Every single day, an avalanche of people asks me, Shimon Oliveira, how do you manage to speak to millions of people on YouTube every month? How do you master communication to the point of reaching almost 1 million subscribers and followers, going head-to-head with the system on all social networks? My friends, with that in mind, my team and I came up with a killer idea. And no, it's not another virtual theoretical course to waste your time. It's a brutal in-person immersion, physical, right here in my studio's hands-on. You will learn to read the codes, understand the triggers, and master what guarantees me this absolute success in high-impact communication. So I ask you, looking into your eyes, if I open the black box of my method for you to come here, step into my studio and sit at this same table. Would you like to have this opportunity? Go down to the comments now and type in all caps, I want it. Write that now, because very soon we will bring big news that will change your game forever. Stop wasting time trying to find that cool movie on Netflix or Amazon. We created a channel with tips on series and movies without woke culture, without whining. Just so you can make better use of your time with your family. Link in the description, in the pinned comment, and in the card that will also appear on your screen. Now subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and like the video. It takes work to make this. Shield your mind. I'm Shimon Oliveira, and I'll see you next time.